every day you should have a knowledge base and an example, because we're responding all day long. We're always responding. And that's because we're always having information being given to us. We're interacting with people. I mean, you could right now be getting notifications on your phone. You can either choose to respond to said notifications, or you can do what I do and turn notifications off on my phone so it doesn't distract me. Easy step. Take that for one. Or you could stop, get distracted, move into said notification that you think is a priority, and then never come back to this conversation. But
how many times do we respond because somebody's telling us something? We're like, respond, but we have zero idea for the information we just received. I do that all the time.
Yeah, it's
Morgan
true.
tell me something. I'm like, okay. And she's like, what did I just say? I'm like,
And nothing.
She just
Yeah.
called me out.
You're like, shoot. And then you shouldn't have said the thing, right? You're like, yeah, sure you can, to the kids. And then like, wait, no, you can't do that, right? Stop, come back. So one of the things I was thinking about was, why do we respond generally? And why do we generally, the times that I respond that I have to come back and apologize for, why do I respond that way? And the answer that I came up with as you were talking was protection. We're looking to protect our emotion. We're looking to protect our initial opinion. We're looking to protect, this is like pride, right? This is what pride is rooted in, and our ego. And I recently had an encounter with my sister, and I was so offended, and I responded in anger, which, if you know me, Aunt knows me really well, like anger is probably the least response mechanism that I ever respond with. But isn't it interesting that we respond to different people who have either had a backstory that's a variable, or you have a different relationship with them, right? We're going to respond to people differently based on that particular person or the history with that person.
Right.
I was so offended and so angry. The reason I was offended was because it was the antithesis of my intention. And the second reason I was offended was because she was going after my relationship with the Lord and the way in which I responded. So I am a defender of my God when that's not necessary. He can defend himself.
That's right.
And I'm a protector of my ego and my original intention. I had a really hard day. It was really hard, probably 12 hours of lots of different emotions, but ultimately anger. And so the following morning, of course, as good as God is, and this is why we need to seek God immediately in these types of scenarios, but it was at that point that I finally sought God later. And he, in his good word, illuminated exactly what the anger and my response was. And it was a clear conviction moment of, wow, I got that wrong. I had a really awesome opportunity to share my heart, to share my why, to share the intention, and to do so in a place that would be receiving. We talked about giving and receiving, rather than creating another barricade, another offense, because offense is just building another fence post, another fence post, another fence post. I was at this point, Mr. Wilson from Home Improvement, and all my sister can see is my eyes. So of course she doesn't know that my intention was good. She sees me as somebody who's trying to kill, steal, and destroy, right? She sees me as the enemy rather than seeing me as a neighbor. And a neighbor, you come to a very different, I go to Anthony when I'm offended very differently than I go to sometimes even my sister. And so protection, let's talk about like this response and how can I shift that in the future?
Well, I want to ask you something real quick, because we talked last week and we say this quite often, every conversation, every moment, because in that moment, what you did was shift that from a moment of accusation to a conversation.
Totally.
So you had something to give, which we just heard. What did you have to gain in that moment?
Oh gosh. Listening,
Yeah.
more, understanding her anger, like where was her offense coming from? What was her lens?
Did you have any perspective? Like, she brought some perspective to that maybe you didn't have, that you could see yourself through that lens, and either A, say that's not the way it is, or say, why is it like that? So now that perspective is huge. We miss this so many times, but when somebody else comes to the conversation, you have a fresh perspective. Sometimes it's a fresh perspective on yourself that you need, because you get good at knowing what you look like.
Yeah.
And the moment you do something, somebody's like, well, this is the way it comes off. And it's like, wow, that's not me, but I needed that perspective, because if you see it, then maybe somebody else sees it.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes we can get into a place of feeling really seen, heard, and known by God.
Mm-hmm.
And not having that level of intimacy with people,
Yeah.
that we're seen. And she literally said these words, like, we're never going to see eye to eye. I see you through a foggy lens because of our past. And it really made me sad, because I feel like when we live in an altered state and we now see ourselves for all the muck and the grime and the mud that we've carried along the way, and we truly have a season of transformation with the Lord, or a moment of transformation, I believe that's also possible, that we're given new eyes to see other people, and we're given eyes to see with such empathy, with such compassion, with a new level of grace. And even though my response was anger, it was not about her, it was about me in that moment.
Yeah.
And so I rebutted that. I'm like, that's sad. Like, we're both Christian, right? We're both living for the Lord. Why do you see me in muck and grime? Why do you see me like that, rather than seeing me in the grace-filled lens of, man, she hurt my feelings and let's have a conversation, rather than what you said, from an accusation perspective and an assumption? Because I think that's how we respond often, is we assume we know what they meant. When Gary's best tactic, my husband, I'm always learning from him, is ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so if someone is looking to respond, rather than respond, why don't you respond with a question, right? He always says, ask a question to the question. And we do this with our kids all the time. And the more that I have to be quiet to formulate said question, that little moment, that gap between the explosion, like you did with Morgan, that explosion that I did with my sister, that explosion that we do with our children or whomever that we love, we literally love them so much, is an opportunity to respond the way Christ would, rather than respond the way our flesh would.
Jesus asked so many questions,
Oh, all the
even
time.
to people who are just wrong. He would
Yeah.
ask them a question. Why? Because he wanted them to respond.
Yeah.
And I think you bring a great point with this. Our first response should always be a pause.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have to ask a question, instead of try to tell them something, a pause causes you to begin to formulate what your question would be. So we do this a lot. We accuse people, or we point out something of somebody, instead of, when you ask a question on why they think that way or why they say that,
Yeah.
what you now get to do is hear the story behind the story behind what you can see or what you think, and really begin to hear the why behind it. Doesn't change maybe that they're broken. It doesn't change that they're wrong, but it gives you fresh perspective on the why behind it. I think there's a lot of people who are stuck in broken mindsets that we could get offended by, that we could point out and say, that's wrong, but then we don't ask the questions to, well, how did you end up here? Because
Yeah.
then we begin to hear their story, and there's an invitation into that place of learning. And then we can position ourselves to not only point and call out, but we can position them to help, or it may be to help us to understand. So I think our first response, learning this one will be huge, is pausing.